The Flight Lieutenant, The Rise and Rule of Jerry John Rawlings. Accra, June 16, 1979. On a beach near Teshi Military Range, 3 former heads of state of Ghana are tied to stakes. A firing squad raises its rifles. Within minutes, General Ignatius Akampong, General Fred Akufo, and General Akwasi Afrifa, men who had each in their turn ruled this nation, are dead. The man who set this in motion is 12 years younger than the youngest of them. He is 31 years old. He is not a general. He is not even a colonel. He is a junior Air Force officer who, 4 weeks earlier, had been sitting in a prison cell awaiting his own execution for trying to overthrow the government. His name is Jerry John Rawlings. Over the next 20 years, this one man will rule Ghana twice, once as a revolutionary who seized power by force, and once as an elected president who voluntarily walked away from it. He will be called a murderer and a liberator, sometimes by the same people. He will execute his predecessors and then hand over power peacefully to his successor. He will preside over firing squads and free elections in the same decade. This is the story of Jerry John Rawlings, the boy who never knew if his own father wanted him, the pilot who never became one, and the coup maker who tried and largely succeeded in remaking an entire nation twice over. Chapter 1: A Son of Two Worlds. Jerry John Rawlings was born on June 22, 1947, in Accra, then the capital of the British Gold Coast colony. His life began with a complication that would follow him in different forms for the rest of his days. He was the product of two worlds that colonial society did not want to see joined. His father, James Ramsay John, was a Scottish pharmacist working in the colony. His mother, Victoria Agbotui, was a Ghanaian woman of Ewe descent from the Volta region. Their relationship was never formalized into marriage, and James John eventually returned to Scotland, leaving Victoria to raise their son largely on her own in a colonial society that had little patience for a mixed-race, illegitimate child. Rawlings would later describe his childhood in terms of that absence. A father who was, for practical purposes, not there, and a mother who worked hard to give her son an education and a sense of dignity in spite of it. He grew up straddling two identities, too Ghanaian for some of the expatriate world his father belonged to, and marked as different, half-caste, in the era's cruel vocabulary, among many of his Ghanaian peers. Biographers and Rawlings himself have pointed to this early experience of exclusion as something that shaped his later political instincts, a lifelong suspicion of entrenched elites, and an identification with ordinary people who felt shut out of power and opportunity. Whether that is armchair psychology applied after the fact, or a genuine through line in the man's life, it is impossible to say with certainty. But it is a connection Rawlings drew himself in interviews more than once. He was educated at Akamoto School, one of the Gold Coast's most prestigious institutions, the same school that had produced Kwame Nkrumah, the man who would lead Ghana to independence in 1957 and become its first president. Rawlings grew up, in other words, in the shadow of Nkrumah's Ghana, a newly independent nation trying to define itself as a leader of Pan-African liberation, even as its economy and institutions struggled under the weight of that ambition. By the time Rawlings was a teenager, Nkrumah had been overthrown in a 1966 military coup, the first of what would become a long and turbulent pattern in Ghanaian politics. Coup, counter-coup, brief civilian interludes, and coup again. Rawlings came of age watching this cycle, watching governments rise on the promise of national renewal and fall to corruption, mismanagement, or simple hunger for power. In 1967, Rawlings joined the Ghana Air Force as a cadet. He trained as a pilot and was commissioned in 1969, eventually earning his wings and the rank that would define his public identity for the rest of his life, Flight Lieutenant. He became known as a skilled and disciplined officer, technically excellent, physically imposing, and, according to those who served alongside him, deeply frustrated by what he saw around him. An officer corps he believed was riddled with corruption, and a political class he believed was looting the country while ordinary Ghanaians suffered. By the late 1970s, that frustration would no longer stay contained within the walls of a barracks. Chapter 2: Ghana in Crisis. To understand what Rawlings did next, it helps to understand the Ghana he was doing it in. By the late 1970s, the country was in a severe economic crisis. Inflation was soaring. Basic goods, sugar, milk, soap, fuel, were scarce, and what little there was often disappeared into a black market known locally as kalabule, a Hausa-derived term for profiteering and hoarding. Ghana was, at the time, ruled by General Fred Akufo, who headed the Supreme Military Council, the latest in a series of military governments that had followed Nkrumah's overthrow. Akufo had himself taken power in a palace-style coup against his predecessor, General Ignatius Akayampong, in 1978, largely because Akayampong's economic policies and his union government scheme, an attempt to fuse military and civilian rule without real elections, had become wildly unpopular. Corruption within the senior officer corps was, by most contemporary accounts, extensive. Senior military officers were widely believed to be profiting from the very shortages that were crushing ordinary Ghanaians, using their positions to control the black market in scarce goods, import licenses, and foreign currency. For a junior officer like Rawlings, watching senior colleagues live comfortably while soldiers and civilians alike went without, the anger was personal as well as political. Akufo's government had, to its credit, promised a return to civilian rule, and elections were scheduled for the middle of 1979. But for Rawlings and a small circle of like-minded junior officers, the promise of eventual elections did nothing to address what they saw as an urgent need: accountability for years of military misrule and economic plunder before power was handed back to civilians. It was in this atmosphere, economic desperation above and simmering resentment within the junior ranks of the military below, that Rawlings decided to act. Chapter 3: The Failed Coup and the Court-Martial. In the early hours of May 15, 1979, Rawlings, then a 31-year-old flight lieutenant, led a group of junior officers in an attempt to seize control of key military installations in Accra, aiming to topple the Supreme Military Council. The attempt failed. Loyalist forces put it down within hours, and Rawlings was arrested. He was placed before a court-martial, facing what appeared to be a near-certain death sentence for mutiny. But something unusual happened in that courtroom that would change the trajectory of Ghanaian history. Rather than staying quiet or pleading narrowly for his own life, Rawlings used the proceedings as a platform. He spoke openly and passionately about the corruption within the senior military ranks, about kalabule, about the suffering of ordinary soldiers and citizens while officers enriched themselves. Accounts from journalists and officers present describe a courtroom that was, in effect, transformed from a trial of a mutineer into something closer to a public airing of grievances against the entire ruling establishment. The effect was electric. Word of Rawlings' defiant testimony spread through the ranks and onto the streets of Accra. He became, almost overnight, a folk hero to junior soldiers and to a public exhausted by scarcity and disillusioned with military rule. Radio broadcasts and word of mouth carried his message that the coup had failed, but that the man behind it was saying out loud what everyone already believed. Rawlings was sentenced to death and held in detention, awaiting execution. But sympathetic junior officers, men who had listened to his court-martial testimony and shared his anger, began organizing. On June 4, 1979, roughly 3 weeks after his arrest, they stormed the prison and freed him. What followed was not simply a jailbreak, it was a second, and this time successful coup. One that Rawlings would now lead not from the shadows of a barracks plot, but from the front, with the momentum of public sympathy already behind him. Chapter 4: The June 4th Revolution and the House Cleaning. The June 4th uprising put power in the hands of a new body, the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, or AFRC, with Rawlings as its chairman. The AFRC framed itself not as a permanent government, but as a temporary corrective force, one that would purge the military and political establishment of corruption and then hand power to a civilian government through elections that were already scheduled for later that year. Rawlings called it a house cleaning exercise, and for a certain segment of Ghanaian military and political leadership, that cleaning was brutal and final. On June 16, 1979, three former heads of state, General Ignatius Akiampong, General Fred Akufo, and General Akwasi Afrifa, were executed by firing squad, along with several other senior military officers. Their offenses, in the eyes of the AFRC, were corruption and misrule during their years in power. There were no lengthy public trials in a conventional sense. Special military tribunals conducted swift proceedings, and executions followed quickly. It is worth pausing here because this moment is the one that divides opinion on Rawlings more sharply than almost any other in his career. To his supporters, the executions were a necessary and overdue reckoning, a signal that no officer, however senior, was above accountability, and that the era of military leaders enriching themselves at the nation's expense was over. To his critics, they were a brutal, legally dubious act of revolutionary violence. Executions carried out with minimal due process against men whose guilt, however plausible, was never tested in anything resembling a fair trial. Both of these views can be, and are, held by serious historians of Ghana today. What is not in dispute is the impact. The executions sent shockwaves through Ghana's military and political class and cemented Rawlings' image, for better or worse, as a leader willing to use lethal force against the country's most powerful men in the name of the ordinary citizen. True to its word, however, the AFRC did not cling to power. Just months after taking control, in September 1979, it oversaw elections and transferred power to a civilian government led by President Hilla Lyman of the People's National Party. Rawlings remarkably stepped back from formal power, at least for the moment, and returned, at least nominally, to military life. It would not last. Chapter 5, The Second Coming, December 31st, 1981. Hilla Lyman's civilian administration inherited a country in economic freefall, and it struggled, by most accounts badly, to arrest the decline. Inflation remained punishing, corruption did not disappear, and the deep structural problems in Ghana's economy proved far more stubborn than a change of government alone could fix. Rawlings, watching from the sidelines, grew openly critical of Lyman's government, accusing it of failing to deliver on the promises of reform that the AFRC's house cleaning was supposed to have made possible. On December 31st, 1981, Rawlings struck again. In a second coup, he overthrew Lyman's elected government and returned to power, this time not as the leader of a short-lived revolutionary council with a promised exit date, but as the head of a new body called the Provisional National Defense Council, or PNDC, which would govern Ghana for more than a decade. In his broadcast announcing the coup, Rawlings spoke not of temporary correction, but of fundamental transformation, a call, in the language of the era, for a genuine revolution to redistribute power away from entrenched elites and toward ordinary Ghanaians, organized through People's and Workers' Defense Committees at the local level. It was, rhetorically at least, a sharp turn toward a more radical, left-leaning vision of politics, one that unsettled Western governments and drew, in its early years, warmer signals from states like Libya and Cuba than from Washington or London. This second seizure of power would prove far more consequential and far more durable than the first. Chapter 6, The PNDC Years. Revolution Meets the IMF. The early years of PNDC rule were marked by real turbulence. The defense committees that Rawlings' government empowered at the community and workplace level sometimes became instruments of local score settling and revolutionary zeal that spilled into intimidation and abuse, particularly against business people, market women, and perceived opponents of the revolution. Human rights organizations documented detentions without trial, media censorship, and violence against dissenters during this period, a legacy that, alongside the 1979 executions, remains one of the most serious charges leveled against Rawlings' record. But by the mid-1980s, faced with an economy that was, by nearly every measure, in ruins, Rawlings made a decision that startled many of his own ideological allies. He turned to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, adopting a structural adjustment program known as the Economic Recovery Program. This was, in a sense, a remarkable pivot. A self-declared revolutionary leader who had come to power denouncing Western-aligned elites and championing a socialist-inflected vision of grassroots power, now implementing austerity measures, currency devaluation, privatization of state enterprises, and fiscal discipline of exactly the kind favored by international financial institutions. The economic results over time were genuinely significant. Inflation, which had spiraled out of control, was brought down. Growth returned. Ghana became something of a poster child for structural adjustment in Africa during the late 1980s, cited by the IMF and World Bank as an example of a country willing to take painful medicine and see tangible macroeconomic improvement as a result. But the human cost of that medicine was severe and unevenly distributed. Public sector layoffs, cuts to subsidies on food and fuel, and reduced social spending hit poor and working-class Ghanaians hard, the very people in whose name the 1981 revolution had been declared. Critics have long pointed to this as one of the central contradictions of the Rawlings era. A government that seized power promising to empower ordinary people, but whose signature economic program imposed real hardship on those same people in the name of national recovery. Supporters of Rawlings counter that without the economic recovery program, Ghana's economy might well have collapsed entirely, and that the stabilization it achieved laid the groundwork for the more genuine growth and poverty reduction that followed in later years. Both the hardship and the eventual stabilization are documented. How to weigh one against the other remains a genuinely contested question among economists and historians of Ghana, not a settled one. Chapter 7: From Soldier to Statesman, the 1992 Constitution. By the early 1990s, both domestic pressure and a broader global wave of democratization, the end of the Cold War, the wave of transitions across Eastern Europe and Africa, pushed Rawlings toward a decision that many observers doubted he would ever make, submitting his rule to a popular vote. In 1992, Ghana adopted a new constitution establishing the Fourth Republic, with multi-party elections and term limits for the presidency. Rawlings, who had ruled by decree for over a decade, now formed a political party, the National Democratic Congress, and stood as its candidate for the presidency he had already held by force for 11 years. He won that 1992 election and was re-elected in 1996 for a second and, under the new constitution, final term. Critics at home and abroad questioned how free and fair those elections truly were, given Rawlings' control of state institutions, media, and security forces built up over the preceding decade. Advantages that any long-ruling incumbent enjoys, but which were especially pronounced in his case. Opposition parties in 1992 in particular alleged serious irregularities, and some boycotted the subsequent parliamentary elections that year in protest. Nonetheless, international observers broadly assessed the elections as reflecting the genuine will of Ghanaian voters, even if conducted on an uneven playing field, and Rawlings' electoral victories are generally recognized as substantively real. As an elected president, Rawlings continued many of the economic policies of the PNDC era, while also expanding on decentralization efforts and continuing to invest, with mixed but real success, in infrastructure, education, and health. Ghana in the 1990s was, by regional standards, relatively stable, a marked contrast to the coup and crisis cycle of the 2 decades that preceded his rule. Chapter 8: The Peaceful Handover. Perhaps the single most consequential decision of Rawlings' later political life came not from seizing power, but from relinquishing it. Ghana's 1992 constitution imposed a 2-term limit on the presidency, and in the year 2000, having served the maximum 2 elected terms, Rawlings stepped down. His chosen successor within the NDC, Vice President John Mills, lost the 2000 election to John Coup of the opposition New Patriotic Party. Rawlings handed over power peacefully to Coup, a former political opponent from a rival party, in a transition that was, by any regional standard of the era, remarkably smooth. For a man who had twice taken power by force, who had presided over the execution of 3 former heads of state, this act of stepping aside according to a constitutional term limit was, to many observers, an extraordinary bookend to his career. It stood in sharp contrast to a pattern seen elsewhere on the continent, where leaders who came to power through military coups often amended constitutions or manipulated processes to cling to office indefinitely. Ghana's peaceful transfers of power in 2000 and in subsequent elections since are frequently cited as a foundation of the country's reputation today as one of Africa's more stable and credible democracies. A foundation that traces directly back to the 1992 constitutional order Rawlings himself helped establish, and to his willingness to abide by its limits. Chapter 9: Legacy, Contradictions, and Final Years. After leaving office, Rawlings remained a significant and often outspoken figure in Ghanaian public life. He was known for blunt criticism of his NDC successors, as well as opposition governments, accusing later leaders of exactly the kind of corruption he had once claimed to be stamping out. A charge that struck some observers as ironic, given his own record, and others as evidence of a genuinely consistent set of convictions that outlasted his time in office. Assessing Rawlings' overall legacy means holding 2 things at once. On one hand, a leader who seized power through force on 2 occasions, who oversaw the extrajudicial execution of 3 former heads of state and other officers, and whose early revolutionary period involved documented human rights abuses, including detentions without trial and violence carried out in the name of revolutionary committees. On the other hand, a leader who stabilized a collapsing economy, who ultimately built and then respected a constitutional, multi-party democratic order, and who left office peacefully when the constitution he helped write said his time was up. A decision that, more than perhaps any other, shaped Ghana's subsequent decades as a comparatively stable democracy in a region where that has often been rare. Historians and Ghanaians themselves remain divided on how to weigh these parts of his record against each other. Some view the early violence as an unforgivable stain that no later achievement can erase. Others view it as a harsh but historically explicable episode in a longer arc that ultimately bent toward accountable, democratic government. Both positions are argued sincerely and by serious people, and this documentary does not attempt to resolve that debate for you. Jerry John Rawlings died on November 12, 2020, at the age of 73, following a brief illness. His death prompted an outpouring of tributes from across Ghana's political spectrum, including from leaders of the very party, the NPP, that had long been his most consistent political rival, an indication of just how central a figure he remained in the country's sense of its own modern history, whatever disagreements persisted about how to judge him. Closing. Jerry John Rawlings spent 20 years at the center of Ghanaian politics, first as a coup maker who executed the men who came before him, and later as an elected president who handed power to the men who came after him. Few African leaders of his generation embody so completely the contradictions of the post-colonial military to democratic transition. The violence of revolutionary seizure and the discipline of constitutional restraint held within the same career and often within the same man's own account of his convictions. Whether history ultimately remembers him primarily for what happened on that beach at Teshi in June of 1979, or for what happened at the handover ceremony in January of 2001, may depend less on the facts of his life, which are, in their broad outline, well established, than on what each generation of Ghanaians decides those facts should mean.